going to throw. One-on-one. Davis has it. Touchdown. Carolina wins. Carolina is the Coastal Division champion. Javonte Williams to the left of Howell. He'll send him out into the flat right side. Howell looking, standing tall, lets it go. Man there. Touchdown. Touchdown, Carolina. The pistol. Jackson behind him. Hands off to Jackson. He tried a jump pass, and it's intercepted. Surratt interception. Holy cow, Carolina's going to win. And off to Javonte Williams again. Pops it to the left. Javonte leaps over a man, crosses the 50, trucks over a defender, spins by another. Goodness gracious, he's down to about the 15, and he did absolutely everything in one carry.
Here's the shotgun snap to Aguilar. Drops back. Pressure coming. Aguilar floats it up. Incomplete. No flags. Head on back up the mountain. Carolina wins it in double overtime. Loftus out of the shotgun. Throws to the end zone. Incomplete. Incomplete. The bell belongs to us. Carolina wins it. 47-45 in double overtime.
Bernard fields it at the 26. Heading to the far side. Gio at the 35. Gio, he's at the 50. No, he's not. Yes, he is. Gio is going to take it for a touchdown. Are you kidding me?
What's going on, guys? Welcome into another edition of the Heel Tough Blog podcast. Coming at you on a Wednesday night as we continue our position previews for the 2025 season. Tonight, it will be the wide receivers that we will be talking about here on this edition of the show. And we will break down the entire wide receiver room from top to bottom, all the guys that'll be there this year. It's a little bit different than some of the other position rooms that we have in terms of how I have it broken down. But you'll see what I'm talking about here in a minute. We'll also talk about Carolina being picked to finish 8th in the preseason poll that came out earlier today. I don't think anybody is too shocked by that, but it does show you what the rest of the league thinks of Carolina. What did we think about where Carolina comes out in that preseason poll, and where did we pick Carolina in our preseason poll? We'll tell you all about that. And then one of the Tar Heels defensive players lands on a watch list for their position. We'll tell you which player that is and what award watch list he is on as he heads into this upcoming season. But as I mentioned, we are here to talk wide receivers, and we are here to talk about a position that is about as inexperienced as it gets when it comes to this team and when it comes to the makeup of this group. There's a lot of areas on this team where you're going to see a lot of inexperience. We're going to talk about a lot of them on the defensive side of the ball, more so than the offensive side of the ball. But this is a position group that you pretty much got one guy that's been here for a while, that's been doing this for a while. The rest of the group is very, very young and has a lot of potential. But I do think there is some worry about how Carolina is going to stack up with the rest of the ACC, especially early on in the season with this group. How I laid it out and what I really thought of when we were talking about the wide receiver position for this year is I think there are tiers to this wide receiver room. I've got 5, and we'll kind of talk about each group separately, but I think that's kind of how you tier it off at this point of the off season. I think there's one guy that has really jumped from the second tier into the first tier. I think there's a guy that's on the precipice of jumping from the third tier to the second tier. And so we have to talk about all of those. But just, to start out here, buddy, what do you think overall of this wide receiver room, and where are you at? Because I think it's hard to argue the talent in that room, but a lack of experience is certainly something that can hurt you.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest factor when you look at this offense as a whole unit going into this upcoming year. You're having a group of 5 quarterback make the transition, you believe, to being a starter at the power conference level. we're big Davy and Goss guys, so you've got a guy in your backfield that you feel comfortable handing the football to, 15, 20, 25 times. But you look at the pass catching room, and it's why we kind of talked about the other night, does the offense need to be maybe more run oriented early on? Because the wide receiver room, I think, is going to be the biggest, the position unit that grows the most as the season moves along. I think it's important to make it known there's not a lack of talent in the room. There's talent here, and there are guys that are capable of being really good football players. We just got to see them produce in Tar Heel uniforms. Guys outside of Kobe Paysour, who, when he's healthy, I think is as underrated a wide receiver in the ACC. We're big fans of Jordan Shipp. I think he's poised to be a breakout candidate. You've seen flashes of what Chris Culliver can do and what he's capable of being for Carolina. And then you've added, some other guys via the transfer portal, a guy like Adrian Wilson, who committed to 27 different schools in 7 months, but was a 4-star prospect. And so I think, we're gonna learn a lot about this group early and often, but it's not like Mac Brown left the cupboard bare in terms of talent. There's just not a lot of proven commodities in the position group as we sit here today.
Yeah, the most proven guy is Kobe Paysour, and he's coming off of a year last year that really didn't live up to the hype that I think most people expected he was going to be able to do. 21 catches, 365 yards, no touchdowns in 13 games for Carolina. And, part of it was that he wasn't on the field at all times. The other part of it was that, they were trying to play him on the outside. I would love for Carolina to come to the realization that I think we all believe at this point from seeing him throughout his career. When he was Josh Downs' backup back in 2022, he was incredibly effective. 29 catches, 324 yards, and 4 touchdowns that season in limited reps when Josh Downs was out, was playing in the slot, and that was where he was most effective. In 2023, played in the slot again, played in 5 games, 22 catches, 282 yards, 3 touchdowns in the first 5 games of the season, but then unfortunately goes down with a broken foot, ends up trying to come back late in the season, breaks his other foot, and now, we're at the position where we're at with him where, really, for Carolina, they're looking for him to step up and become that guy that he was before. Is he going to be able to do that? I'm not sure. But I do think that one thing that would help him is if they moved him back inside to slot receiver. I believe that the best 3 starters for Carolina this year would be to have Jordan Shipp and Chris Culliver on the outside and to have Kobe Paysour in the slot. But I don't think that is how they're going to use him. So he's going to have to find a way to be more effective on the outside. And hopefully, getting this offseason, another year under his belt, away from the broken feet. Hopefully that will help him be more effective this year for Carolina.
Yeah, I would love to see him in the slot. I think even if he's not there primarily, I don't see Bill Belichick and, Freddie Kitchens and the offensive staff forcing him to play primarily on the outside, because if they go back and watch his film where he was at his best, it would be coaching malpractice to not have him in the slot, at least, I don't know, a third of the time. I'm with you. I think the 3 best receivers in your base offense should be, Chris Culliver, Jordan Shipp on the outside, Paysour on the slot. And then you go from there, and then you see how kind of how the depth guys and some of the other guys that you added, whether it was in high school recruiting or through the transfer portal, how that room ultimately shakes out. I do think, as much as I'm a big believer in Shipp and him individually, I do think this is going to be a committee approach at wide receiver, which is not something foreign to what you saw from Bill Belichick in the NFL. Outside of when Tom Brady had Randy Moss and Wes Welker in the mid to late 2000s, it was a bunch of no-name guys at the wide receiver position. And they had a group of dudes, 5, 6, 7 dudes that would produce, and then they would mix the tight ends into the passing game as well. I think you're going to try to see Bill Belichick try to replicate that same formula at the college level, just because it makes you so much harder to defend. Whereas in the past couple years, even though Carolina had, exceptional quarterback play, you knew where the ball was maybe going to when you needed to convert that 3rd and 6 or whatever it was. And so I think there's a clear distinction between who your best 3 receivers are and who they're maybe going to count on the most. But I do think this will be a position group that, as you have it broken down into tiers, I think they are going to ask guys from tier 1 through tier 4 to produce at different points this upcoming season.
Yeah, it could be. And I think that's certainly something that could be on the table. Now, the other guy that's in tier 1 that I have with Kobe Paysour is Jordan Shipp. And I think he's gotten there here from what we've seen this offseason. Again, we don't get a lot of reports out of camp. We didn't get anything really back in the spring. But it really says something to me that Jordan Shipp, as a sophomore, is a guy that was chosen to speak during a press conference back in June. He gets chosen to come to ACC kickoff, and he's a guy that is being talked about as one of the biggest leaders on the team. I think that's huge for him. And you look at him, in 162 snaps last year, hauled in 9 passes for 114 yards and a touchdown. I would say decent numbers for a true freshman that was stuck in a room that was pretty packed last year. But now, there's more responsibility on his plate. I think this is the year where you see him step up. And when I look at him, I see one of the more complete receivers that Carolina's had, a guy that can really affect all 3 areas of the game, the deep, intermediate, and short passing games. And that's something that Carolina's really looking for. And they want that guy on the outside, someone that you can trust and go to in those important situations. Not saying that Kobe Paysour can't be that guy. I do think that we saw that ability in him back in 2023, but we still don't know if he's going to look like that version of him or if that version is behind him due to the injuries. If that's the case, then Jordan Shipp is in perfect position to become the leading receiver for this team. And I think even if you do have a healthy Paysour, there's going to be a battle here because Shipp really just brings that much talent to the table and has a chance to be Carolina's next great wide receiver.
Yeah, I think he's the most explosive, dynamic, game-changing wide receiver on this roster. He's a guy that, as you mentioned, I think it can make impactful plays at all 3 levels in the passing game. And I do think he'll be a guy that he'll be featured early and often, and they're going to try to get him the football because of what I think he can do with the football in his hands. I think, there's a physicality there that you like. When he catches the football, he can break a tackle or 2. He's got the speed necessary to run away from defenders. And I think the best point you brought up is you don't get the media responsibilities that he was given by accident as a sophomore playing under Bill Belichick. And so I think there was something there from a leadership aspect that they really had to to put him behind the microphone as often as they did here this past summer. And so I think he's an easy kid to root for. And I think he embodies what we want a Tar Heel to be on and off the football field. And so I do think that he's poised to, I don't know if it's going to be like Josh Downs level a breakout, but I do think this could be a guy that could put up, 60, 65 catches. I think 1,000+ yards is definitely on the table for him. And I would say at least 8 touchdowns or eight receiving touchdowns. Very much attainable for him as well. And if Carolina can get that kind of production out of him, you can keep Kobe Paysour healthy. I think this passing game, as it evolves, will become more dangerous. It could really unlock not just Gio Lopez, but the entire offense as well under Freddie Kitchens.
Yeah, for reference, that breakout season that you're talking about with Josh Downs, 101 catches, 1,335 yards receiving, and 8 touchdowns. I think that might be a little bit lofty, But I mean, getting to maybe, the numbers that he had, not necessarily the amount of catches, because as a slot receiver, as someone that was relied on that heavily, I think Carolina this year is going to have more options that they're going to be spreading it around to. I think, as you said, really guys from tier 1 to potentially even tier 4 will be called upon to step up and make plays this year. But his senior year, Josh Downs, 1,029 yards and 11 touchdowns. If you told me that's what Shipp had this season, I wouldn't think that was the craziest thing. I mean, we talked about it when we were talking about the running backs. I think him and Davian Goss are the guys that you feel the most confident in as breakout players this year. And I think that there's just, for some reason with Jordan Shipp, when I watched him back in high school, I mean, this kid was as reliable as it got. He had the most reliable hands on the field. Anything that you threw his way was going to be caught. And it really was highlighted by a huge game that started off his senior season where, again, Providence Day High School playing against, I forget who it was that they were even playing against in that game, but it was one of the best teams in the state. All the attention is on a guy like Kendre Harrison, who was there at the time, and Jordan Shipp was the guy that really shined through in that game. So, yeah, I think he's certainly going to be a guy that's going to have a huge season this year for Carolina and is going to be one of the reasons why this passing game will be relied upon, I think, as the season goes along, and can be one of the better units in all of college football. Now you get to the second tier, and some people may be saying, well, how do you not have Chris Culliver in the first tier? Well, part of it is that he's not even guaranteed to start. If they start Paysour on the outside along with Jordan Shipp, well, then that means that Chris Culliver is not going to be starting because they're not going to be playing him in the slot. He's an explosive player on the outside, but doesn't really have the technical route running ability. His route tree isn't nearly as complex as it would need to be if he's going to play in the slot. That's why I think you should see more of Kobe Paysour in the slot, on top of the fact that he's effective. But I mean, the thing is with Chris Culliver too, he only has 7 catches in his career. It feels like he has more based off of what we saw from him last year. And, he had a big performance in the game against NC State where he caught 2 passes for 96 yards. And that provided some hope for what his future could potentially look like. This is another guy that I look at and think he could have a breakout season, but I don't think anything is necessarily guaranteed with him because of the type of player that he is. I'm just hoping that he can live up to that billing that I gave him out of high school, which was a guy that reminded me of De'Ami Brown.
Yeah, I think what you said is correct. So it's 7 career catches?
7 career catches.
But I guess it was the magnitude of every time he made a play probably just felt very important. So we probably magnify how many catches he had. You mentioned the game against NC State with 2 catches for over 90 yards. That definitely goes a long way. He's a guy that, we talk about just as much with Jordan Shipp from when I kind of set the scene for this position preview. It's not that there's not a lack of talent or a lack of ability with him. There just has to be production. This has to now become seeing is now believing, because he is a capable guy. De'Ami Brown's a lofty comparison, but it's not one that I thought when you went that route. I didn't think you were exaggerating. I didn't think you were putting too much of a burden of expectation upon him. I think he was a guy last year, maybe as much as any wide receiver on the roster that's back, that really was held back and hindered from the inconsistency of the quarterback play. If Carolina gets consistent quarterback play from, we imagine Gio Lopez is going to be the starter, whether it's Max Johnson or if Bryce Baker does emerge, as long as he has the same signal caller in the shotgun every Saturday, I think Chris Culliver stands to maybe benefit from that the most. And I do think, breakout for him is definitely on the table. I just wonder, if we're thinking out loud here, what does breakout production look like for him if we're in the camp of Jordan Shipp being, 60, 65 catches, north of 800 yards and maybe 8 touchdowns? What does production for a breakout Jordan or Chris Culliver look like?
I think honestly, with the fact that there's a chance he doesn't play or doesn't, start, but doesn't play as many reps as a guy like Jordan Shipp, a guy like Kobe Paysour, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 yards and maybe 4 or 5 touchdowns, just a guy that is able to take the top off of the defense, gives you that explosive threat down the field. Now, I think he can be more of a complete receiver than that on the outside. I think there's elements of that to his game. It just has to be developed. But that's really where he shined. And Carolina needs that deep threat. You go back to last year, that was one of the things that Carolina really lacked. And I get it, man. J.J. Jones tried to be that guy. He tried to turn his game into that. That wasn't J.J. Jones's game. J.J. Jones was a guy that I think was more complete as a receiver, and it showed, but he wasn't that explosive guy on the outside. This is what Chris Culliver can bring to the table. I mean, just go back and watch what this dude did on special teams as a kick returner. The explosion is there. So you want to see that translate not only before the catch, but after the catch as well for him. I think that's where you're hoping he really shows up this year. And I think he's got a chance to do it. I just think that, now with more opportunities there, this will be where he can shine through. For me, it's about consistency from him. He can't be a guy that's there one week, disappears the next week for Carolina, especially if they're going to rely on him, which I think they will. The other guy that I have listed in tier 2 is the guy that I think is probably going to end up being a starter for Carolina this year in the slot, and that is Aziah Johnson, from Michigan State. He was a guy last year that at Michigan State, in an offense that really wasn't all that great, passing offense that really struggled. Aiden Childs, if I remember correctly, threw the most interceptions in all of college football last year. But I'll tell you one thing about him that I really like. He was targeted 25 times last year, caught 16 passes for 276 yards and 2 touchdowns, and dropped just 1 pass during that time. So he seems like a reliable receiver. I like some of the shiftiness that he brings to the table, really strong route runner. I think this is another guy that really didn't get a ton of opportunities at his last school, but could succeed here for Carolina. I don't expect him to have a massive season like we talked about with Josh Downs or something like that in the slot, but if he is a starter and he gets starter-like reps, I could see this being a guy that has more success for Carolina in the slot than Nate McCullum did, which is a bar that Carolina has to get over this year with that slot group, because last year it was just non-existent at times.
Yeah, he stands at 6 foot tall, $175. You mentioned 16 catches for over 270 yards. That factors out to 17 yards per reception. If he could do that, but let's say you double the catch total, I think you're getting, that's quality production right there. If you can get anywhere from 35 to 40 catches out of him, and then you get that receiving total, north of 400, maybe pushing 500, I think that'll really do wonders for Carolina's offense as they try to be, I think, very diverse in the passing game. You mentioned the quarterback that he had to endure playing last year. I would argue, and it's not much of an argument, he's walking into a better quarterback position here at Carolina, even though Gio Lopez is making the transition to the power conference level. But I do think, he's a transfer that is going to be a difference maker for Carolina. I think Carolina is counting on him to be a difference maker as well. And you're right, man. Nate McCullum, outside of the Minnesota game where he had like 16 catches and made it felt like every play, it just felt like after that moment, he was just never the same guy. And what was frustrating was because there was so much more potential in his game that Carolina just could not unearth, whether it was because of him, whether it was because of Chip Lindsey. But if they're going to be stubborn and more committed to Kobe Paysour working on the outside and not playing primarily in the slot, you've got to find a guy that can produce for you to get open in the middle of the field. I think Johnson is one of those guys, and I think he'll be one of the newcomers in this wide receiver room that we'll be counting on in a big way for this passing game to be the best and the most explosive as it can be.
Yeah, I think, and I think he's more than capable of handling that. I mean, as you mentioned, last year, you look at the numbers that he put up. I mean, to have 17 yards per catch out of the slot, that shows you that there's a level of explosion there. There's a level of big, there's, big plays that he can bring to Carolina's offense. And again, you're looking, this is going to be an offense that we think is definitely going to be a little more methodical. And I think, with him, it would have evened out. If he would have started catching the football a little bit more, I really do feel like it evens itself out. And he probably ends up with a more normal yards per reception. But I do think that he is a guy that does have those explosive traits, especially after the catch. I think he does a really good job making guys miss in the open field. So that's something that Carolina really needs, because that was something that really seemed to be lacking from their group a year ago, was that ability to stack up the yards after catch. We got so used to it when you had guys like Josh Downs that were there that could create those on just about every catch that he made. Hopefully Aziah Johnson is a guy that is able to do that for Carolina this year. Okay, now you move on to the third tier of wide receivers here. And I think this group is very interesting, because I think there's a chance that these guys are going to be big factors for Carolina this year. They can earn more playing time as the season goes along, but going into the year, they are probably looked at as second string guys. They'll appear on the depth chart, but they won't necessarily be overly, expected to be counted on that much to start the season. I start with a guy like Alex Taylor. I went to ACC kickoff. I was asking about some of the guys in the wide receiver room that had really stepped up. The first guy that Jordan Shipp told me was Alex Taylor. The first guy that was a tough cover for Thaddeus Dixon was Alex Taylor. So this is a guy that's being raved about. I remember when I wrote about him back in his recruiting cycle, him, Jordan Shipp in the same recruiting cycle. I believe that was the 2024 cycle, but I may be getting that wrong. It's so tough to keep up with all the different recruiting cycles that are coming through. But when I wrote about him, I said this is the most complete receiver in this room, because I thought that his ability with the 50-50 balls was just as good, if not better, than Jordan Shipp's. And I thought that he really impacted the game in just about every level. Last year, he was a guy that I think really shined in some of the preseason stuff. He was a guy that, was looked at as sort of a practice MVP, that type of guy that was on the rise. And now this year, you look at the receivers that are ahead of him, we're trusting guys that are just a little bit more experienced than him. But I would not be shocked if Alex Taylor is a name that we're talking about as the season goes along, that starts taking some of those reps away. If Kobe Paysour or Chris Culliver starts to struggle, he's certainly a name to keep an eye on.
Yeah, you're talking about a guy who just had, I think it was one catch last year for 15 yards, but there is potential there. And it's another guy that fits the mold. The production, or the lack of the production, isn't a reflection of the talent that he is. I think he's poised to take a step this year and become a guy that maybe when we're doing this preview next year, he's a breakout name that we're talking about that'll be ready to jump on the scene in a big way. So the two guys here, you mentioned with Alex Taylor in tier 3, you got Paul Billups the second in tier 3 as well. Billups, a guy that last year, 4 catches, 27 yards, but there were different times where it felt like in an important situation, you would see him on the field. Maybe the football wasn't thrown his way, but there were snaps he was playing that I would look at you and be pretty blunt and say, why the hell is he on the field? Why is he getting playing time? I think these are guys that you look at and say, this is where the depth and the committee approach are really going to benefit them, because I think Bill Belichick and Freddie Kitchens are going to be open to finding some other guys that they can count on to make plays, keep these guys fresh, not run the same 2-3 wide receivers out there, for 65, 70, 75 plays every single Saturday. So really am eager to see what Alex Taylor looks like in a bigger role, because if you say he was the best wide receiver in that class, that includes Jordan Shipp, then there's something there that we have yet to see at the college level, and hopefully that shows up in a big way this upcoming season.
Yeah, and just because I say that he was a better prospect than Jordan Shipp doesn't necessarily mean that he ends up being better than Jordan Shipp at the college level. Shipp was a guy that I really loved as well in that class. One of my favorites. I mean, you go back to that class, Taylor and Shipp were two of my favorite guys, if not my two favorites. So I think he certainly has a chance to, eventually be alongside Shipp and provide a great 1-2 tandem at the wide receiver spot for Carolina. It's just, does he get on the field a lot this year? Is he able to make that jump this year, or does he maybe have to wait until next year? Paul Billups, I think that's another guy. The reason why he's on the field is because he's developing. It took a little bit of time. He was a guy that when he came in out of the high school level really needed to develop pre-snap. I think he's gotten a little bit better there. The big thing with him is that he can go up and win jump balls. We saw him flash a little bit last spring, and he was a guy that was being talked about by Mac Brown as someone that could step up last season, but never really got the opportunity to do that. And I think now his route tree is a little more complex or a little more complete. I do think that he's a guy that has some ability after the catch, but most importantly, it's that ability to win those contested catches. If he can do that, I mean, Carolina, there's always going to be room for you on the field, and Carolina's looking for those types of guys. So I think that's certainly a name to keep an eye on. Again, this is a group that I just don't know how effective they're going to be able to be with the guys that are ahead of them in the room, but I do think could surprise you, could jump up there if they make big leaps in fall camp, and if some of the guys ahead of them struggle just a little bit. Now we get to tier 4, and tier 4 is really the wild cards. It's the guys that you don't really know a whole lot about in terms of their role on the team this year. I mean, look, they could end up bringing, eventually getting to, a spot where they're taking significant snaps for Carolina. But going into the season, we're looking at them as guys that are buried a little bit on the depth chart, that it's going to take a little bit of time for them to get on the field. I start with Javarius Green, the guy who, was also part of that wide receiver class that Carolina brought in last year with Shipp and Taylor. And yeah, I mean, he's a guy in the slot, very shifty, your typical slot receiver, very explosive. There could be, some reps for him as a kick returner if Carolina wants to conserve Chris Culliver in that area. But it's with how good Chris Culliver was returning kicks last year, I don't expect that they're going to do that. He's also a guy that could factor in as a punt returner, but I think he provides some nice depth at the slot position. And then you talked about Adrian Wilson as a guy that Carolina got as a transfer from Colorado. He had been committed to a lot of schools beforehand, but another explosive playmaker, former 4-star wide receiver. So definitely a guy that has some talent there. And the same thing with Nathan Leacock, another former 4-star wide receiver that transfers in from Purdue after being with them in the spring. Prior to that, he was with Tennessee, in-state guy that Carolina did recruit, and they're hoping he can sort of find his footing here. So a very interesting group. I think there's almost a 4A and 4B. I think those three guys that I just talked about right there, I'm very interested to see what they're able to do this season, if any of them are able to really climb into the 2 deep and maybe get some of those snaps that we talked about, Alex Taylor, Paul Billups, and those guys taking last year.
Let's play a game really quick. Do you think Adrian Wilson finishes the season before entering the transfer portal?
Yeah, I think he'll finish the season. Now, the better question would be, do you think he's on this roster at this time next year? My answer would be yes, but my confidence level would probably be about a 55%.
Yeah, it's going to be because what he came to Colorado, was it Arizona State where he we initially had committed to.
I know TCU was in there somewhere. There's so many different ones.
So, I mean, that guy's maybe got the most colorful wardrobe of all the different colleges he's committed to. Bunch of wasted gear has gone his way. But you know, there is talent there. You don't end up at Colorado with a chance to play for Coach Prime by accident. And so I think of all the guys you mentioned here in Tier 4, I think he's the one that could really, I think, stand out and maybe emerge as a guy that if he's not in the transfer portal and is back on this roster next year, we could be talking about him having a much larger role. I think one thing you got to like about Nathan Leacock is he's bringing some size at 6'3".
Mm-hmm.
So Carolina's getting a little bit bigger. You know, I think that's going to be a big focal point. You know, but just one catch. Last year, same thing with Green, just a single catch, and so I think this is where it really kind of starts to teeter off for Carolina. Those first 6 guys in the first 3 tiers. I think you could see all of them playing significant snaps and there being, production of consequence. It's when you get to here, which is why these guys are in Tier 4, that it's really just uncertain. I think best case scenario is you take advantage of a week 2 game against Charlotte, a game against Richmond, where you can just get these guys on the field, get some snaps, and get some – and really start to develop them in your system. And maybe, because these guys, if they were to stick around with how young they are, these guys could be the future of the position group. So we're banking on player development being much more accelerated under Bill Belichick and his coaching staff. The only way to develop guys to get them on the field, I don't think you're going to see these dudes on the field on Labor Day night against TCU. Can you see them in week 2? Can you see them in week 3? Can you blow out a team or two in ACC play to where you can see them go up against the competition? They'll go in on a week in, week out basis. That's kind of that. That's all going to be determined. But if I had to bank on either of anyone in this tier becoming a impactful player for Carolina in some shape, form, or fashion, I would go Adrian Wilson, just given the fact, he's a high-end 4-star recruit, was going to play for Coach Prime. I think he'll be motivated to kind of shut up the doubters of all the transfer stuff, even though I made a joke about it. I think he would be the guy at Circle that could emerge as a guy that has a much larger role than maybe we anticipate as we sit here in late July.
Yeah, I mean, he's only a true freshman. I mean, the thing is that he's moved around to all these schools. He still has yet to play a college season. This is his first year at the college level. So there's so much potential to his game that I think he's going to have a chance to succeed. It's just whether or not he ends up sticking here with Carolina. Leacock, I think, is also really interesting because of his size. I think his ability to win some of those contested catches over the top, a guy that can pluck the football away from defensive backs could certainly be something that could get him on the field. But yeah, I mean, if we're being honest, I think these guys in this tier, you're looking at them as primarily backups. And unless there are some injuries, you're probably not going to see these guys this season. You're hoping that they're guys that can establish themselves in practice and maybe make a run at being, significant contributors next year. If you are to lose, a guy, you're going to lose Kobe Paysour, but if you are to lose a guy like Chris Culliver, maybe he has a breakout season and goes to the NFL or something like that. Transfers are always something that could possibly happen. By the way, I went through Adrian Wilson. This is the path that he took. TCU decommits, Oregon commits on the same day, decommits from Oregon, takes an official visit to Arizona State, commits to Arizona State, decommits from Arizona State on October 23rd, commits to Colorado on October 26th, and then eventually enrolls at Colorado, spends the spring with them, enters the transfer portal on April 16th, and commits to Carolina on April 17th. So just a wild, wild road for this young man so far, but hopefully he's a guy that ends up sticking at Carolina. Now you get to the second part of tier 4, which is where you get Jason Robinson Jr. and Dayton Sneed. Now, I think Jason Robinson Jr., certainly you can make a case that he should be in that 4A category, should be a guy that we're talking about a little bit more. I just think he's going to be buried behind so many guys at that slot position, and especially if they are going to use Kobe Paysour in the slot some this year. I mean, you got to think already ahead of him is going to be, Aziah Johnson, Javarius Green, and then he could potentially be that third guy there, but he could also be a fourth guy if they use Paysour in the slot. So, I mean, it's asking a lot of him, I think, this year to come in and break through. He was a guy that was a real standout last year in practices at Washington. They said he had a lot of upside, but he ends up coming to Carolina. Hopefully that upside is going to be able to show through, but I don't necessarily think that this is the year. I think he's probably going to be buried on the depth chart, and we'll be, lucky to probably see the field at some point this year.
Yeah, I think we'll be talking about him in a much larger capacity in 2026 as opposed to 2025. But again, that's where I stress the importance of being able to, get some big wins under your belt in terms of margin of victory, or maybe you can just get this guy on the field and start to evaluate him and see what he has. ESPN lists him at 500 or at 5'10", 150 pounds. So
he's tiny.
You would imagine he would be a little shifty fella, probably a guy that can a quick titch can maybe spin and make something happen. Which could make him a lot of fun to watch in the open field. I just don't know how much of that is going to happen this year. But if this is a guy that, stays in the program, doesn't transfer after one season in Chapel Hill, I do think there's a chance where when we're sitting here in 2026, he's bare minimum, maybe listed in tier 3 when we do the position preview, maybe at the back end of tier 2.
Yeah, I think with him, at that size, 5'10", 150 pounds, you are bringing him into the system and you are hoping that your nutrition team can bulk him up just a little bit. That's what I think this year is going to be for him. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he's a guy that comes out of nowhere and really surprises. Maybe he is challenging Javarius Green. This is what sucks about doing these position previews right now, is that we just don't know what is going on at these position groups because we weren't told anything in the spring. So we don't know how certain guys look during the spring to be able to give you the correct assessment as to where exactly everyone's at. The thing with Jason Robinson Jr. is that I think, him being a guy that was with the team back in the spring, that certainly helps him out there. So it's not the craziest thing that he could push Javarius Green a little bit, but I just don't know how big of an impact he's really going to have this year. That's one that I'm hoping that I could be wrong on there, though. I mentioned Dayton Sneed at the wide receiver position as well, former walk-on at Tennessee. Really, a guy that I think Carolina brought in here to try to get his brother in the 2026 recruiting cycle. I think that's really the biggest reason that they brought him in. Maybe he ends up making an effect, for Carolina somewhere down the line. I don't think that this is the year that he ends up doing it. I think it's going to take him some time and he'll be buried on the depth chart. And then you get to tier 5. These are the guys, the freshmen that I think are guaranteed to be redshirted. And, Adrian Wilson, I think, could be a redshirt, but he's also a guy that it wouldn't shock me if he ends up playing a little bit for Carolina. These guys, I would be stunned if they see the field at all this year. Kennedy Uzama, the big wide receiver on the outside, if I remember correctly, 6'5". So he's got tremendous length for a guy that's going to be playing wide receiver. I think they're going to, let him grow into his body a little bit at 6'5", 210 pounds. And then you've got, a couple other guys that'll be factors in the slot. Shenard Clower as well as Madrid Tucker. Those are guys that will be on the roster this year, but I think ultimately will be guys that will probably see a red shirt at the end of the season. So that's your look at the wide receivers, guys. I did want to mention also that I forgot a guy, just completely omitted him in the last edition that we did of the running backs. Wanted to apologize to Charleston French. We completely forgot to mention him when we were talking about the running backs. Now, the good news is that I don't think that he's going to be a guy that's that high on the depth chart. I think he's probably a guy that's 4th or 5th in that running back rotation. But we pride ourselves on being one of those shows that mentions every single player on the roster just in case they end up making some sort of impact this year. And you never know. He's been with Carolina, one of the holdovers. I thought, when he was out there last year, flashed as a former walk-on and a former junior college player. So I think he's certainly a guy that at some point Carolina could use in that backfield, but I think for going into the season, we're probably looking at him as a guy that's buried a little bit on that depth chart and maybe battling with Benjamin Hall and Damon June for some of those reps behind the two-back tandem of Davian Goss and Caleb Hood. All right, guys, we move on to what I told you guys about earlier. Carolina earlier today, the preseason ACC poll was released, and the Tar Heels came in 8th in the preseason poll for this year. Not shocking. I thought this was kind of the area that Carolina was going to fall. In case you guys didn't see it, Clemson, number 1, easily, controlled the first place votes with 167 first place votes. Miami second with 7 first place votes. SMU picked to finish 3rd with 2 first place votes. Georgia Tech 4th with 2 first place votes. Louisville 5th, Duke 6th, 7th Florida State, who got 4 first place votes, which is just stunning and really says a lot about the media that was in attendance, I think, for ACC kickoff. Carolina 8th, Pitt 9th, NC State 10th, Virginia Tech 11th. They did get a first place vote too, which is, again, insane. But Syracuse 12th, BC 13th, 14th Virginia, 15th Cal, 16th Wake Forest, and 17th Stanford. So Carolina not really behind anybody that I think is all that shocking. I think maybe the one team that you would look at, I had everybody that was ahead of Carolina besides Florida State, I had ahead of them. So I think that certainly makes sense that you have all those teams ahead of them this year going into the year. I think all of those teams that we talked about that were ahead of them 1 through 6, I think have the chance or could, when it's all said and done, wind up with 9 wins on the season. I don't know if the math really plays out with that, but I would think that these are teams that are threatening to be 9-10 win teams this year, could get to Charlotte. I think Carolina's right below that. If you're tearing off the conference, I think Carolina's in that group that you could have a really surprising year, could come out of nowhere and surprise people and end up making it to Charlotte, but it would take a lot. It would take a lot for Carolina to get there. So what do you make of Carolina being placed 8th in the preseason ACC poll for this year?
I think it's appropriate, not too high of expectations, but not too low either, because that does put you in the top half of the conference. And considering where the roster was when Bill Belichick got hired, you look at some of the guys they lost in the spring transfer window, in addition to what they added. If they were to finish, at 8th, you're looking at 7 to 8 wins. I mean, maybe you're pushing 9, but that probably includes you going perfect in the non-con, and then you're 8th because of tiebreakers in terms of losing head-to-heads against a Clemson, a Duke, or something like that. I voted them 6th, so I had them 2 spots higher than where they ultimately land from the total vote. But that was me. That was like the high end. When I was going through it, I'm not putting them above Clemson. I'm not putting them above Miami. I'm not putting them above SMU. I'm not putting them above Georgia Tech. I forget who I had fifth. I think I had Louisville fifth. I would not put them above Louisville. I could see a situation where they finish ahead of Duke because they beat Duke in the battle for the victory bell. I don't know what to make of Florida State, so I would not be surprised if Carolina finished ahead of them. So I think you can't be too upset with eighth for year one for Bill Belichick, because I think it's right there in the perfect in the middle, considering there's just so much unknown about this, how this roster will look like when we get to the actual season.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is there's so much new on this roster. And for me, I'm looking at this team and saying if they get to 7 or 8 wins, we're counting this as a successful year. Well, if you're in that range of 7 to 8 wins, I think you're in that range of 7 to 9 in this preseason poll. And I think that's exactly where they landed. I think, right there at 8 is fine, because as you mentioned, top half of the league. I wouldn't have loved it if you were below Pittsburgh, because I do think Carolina is going to be better than Pittsburgh. Remember that Pitt is a team that lost 6 straight to close out the season last year. They're returning a lot of the same guys. I don't know how much different that team is really going to be this year. I think they could probably win 6 or 7 games, but I think when they have to play anybody of significance, they're probably going to end up losing. Carolina's schedule, to me, is so easy that I think it makes a lot of sense to have them in the top half of the league. Now, for me, I had Duke over them because I think Duke probably wins the rivalry game. I think that if you look at it, Carolina is going to lose one of the 2 rivalry games. And from my perspective, I am not going to pick them to lose to State. Not 5 straight. I can't do it. So that's the reason why with 8 and 4, I have them losing to Duke. But I mean, there's a path where Carolina could go 9 and 3. And if they go 9 and 3, then they probably finish top 6 in this poll towards the end of the season. They're 6th in the standings or higher than that. I could see them, being in the same range as Louisville. I think them and Louisville have the most advantageous schedules in the ACC this year. Florida State is just a complete mystery to me as well. But one thing that is not a mystery about them is their quarterback. And I think that we know what Thomas Castellanos is. When things get tough, he is a guy that is going to quit. I think that for Carolina, we don't necessarily see that in Gio Lopez. We see a guy that might take a little bit of time to develop, but once he gets into the season, we feel like he will just continue to grow in this system and will become better and better. So I believe that Carolina, maybe should be 1 spot higher on this list, where I had them at 7th. But I can't really argue with where they put them and the reasons that most people are putting them where they're putting them at. Last thing before we get out of here, Andrew Simpson lands on the Butkus Award watch list. This past season at Boise State, he finished with 45 total tackles, 11 tackles for loss, 3 sacks, 24 total quarterback pressures, 3 forced fumbles, and an interception. The year prior, which was the season where he really broke onto the scene, he had 66 total tackles, 16 tackles for loss, 6.5 sacks, 33 quarterback pressures, 2 forced fumbles, and 2 interceptions. Of course, we've said this multiple times, and we'll say it again when we break down the linebacking core. Carolina hoping that you get more of the 2023 version of Andrew Simpson than you got from him last year. Now, the thing is that he wasn't bad last year. He was on a defense that went to the college football playoff, but you're going to need a guy that's probably going to have to be a little bit more impactful. I don't know how involved you're going to be able to get Kamori House in the run game just because of how small he is. So you need a guy that's sort of a wrecking ball in the middle of that defense, can match some of the numbers that Amari Campbell put up last year. This is one of those awards where, you never really do know what type of season he could put together, and he could potentially end up winning this award. But it's probably going to take a lot to even be on the watch list, I think, says a lot for him, though, and shows just how big of expectations there are on him coming into his time at Chapel Hill. So that's going to wrap up this edition of the podcast. Guys, head over to the website, HeelToughBlog.com. Check out all the stuff that we got up there for you now. We had the offensive line preview that came out last night. I am going to share that on social media tonight, so make sure that you guys are keeping an eye out for that after the show is over. Unfortunately, got limited on Facebook last night, so make sure that you go through those groups, check that out, or go to the page directly and check that out. You can do that there or on the Twitter page at HeelToughBlog. Of course, we're still rolling with all of that stuff, so make sure that you guys are reading that content. That definitely is something that we implore you to do as we get closer and closer to the season. Any updates that we have from camp, we will, have you covered. Camp starts this Saturday, so I'll have a little article that'll preview it, probably talk to you guys about the biggest battles going into camp for this upcoming fall. So make sure that you guys are keeping an eye on the website morning, afternoon, and evening. Just go to the website and check it out, or go to those social media pages, turn on the notification tab on Twitter. That's the best way to do it, so that whenever we have an article, live video, or a recorded edition of the podcast that goes up, you guys can get it. Also, the big thing that we are pushing right now, guys, is go over to YouTube. If you're someone that watches the show, we love the fact that you watch it over on Facebook. We love the fact that you watch it over on Twitter. If that's where you want to stay, that's cool. But if you would, we would love for you to go over and check out our YouTube page, watch it on YouTube, give us a subscription as well. That would definitely help us. Those numbers prove, a little bit more than I think some of the other stuff. So we would greatly appreciate if you did that for us and helped us out there. But that's once again going to wrap it up for this edition of the podcast. Want to thank Josh for hosting with me. Want to thank you guys for watching and listening. And as always, go Tar Heels.